Hello and welcome to Documentary Film, and this week we're going to take a look at Capturing the Freedmans, which is an American film with a rather interesting reputation, which we're going to get into, made in 2003 and originally for HBO, and went on to win some awards. But as you know in this course, we don't go for the easy ones. This is a difficult film to watch, difficult in the subject matter. Formally, it has some interesting problems, but as a document that tries to capture the truth and the elusiveness of truth, it's certainly a film that is well worth considering. So the person that put the film together, Andrew Jarecki, I think Jarecki is the correct pronunciation. Jarecki was actually making a documentary about clowns, in fact, one clown in particular, David Friedman, when he found out about this story. And it just so happens that it was David Friedman's family living in Great Neck, New Jersey. And so this Friedman case was certainly very topical, very much in the news, and I'll mention why very shortly. So what happened was Jarecki finished the film very quickly on David Friedman. Silly Billy is what he was. That was his name. The David Friedman story is the number one clown in New York City. And very soon after that, Jarecki went to Great Neck to see whether he could find out information about the film, or about making the film, certainly. So that is kind of the very brief background to the film. Now, when you watch it, I'd like you sort of to think about these questions. And the first one is, have we seen other films that kind of look like this, where we are trying to capture this elusive thing called the truth? Capital T or lowercase t, doesn't matter. But which films in the course does Capturing the Freedmans resonate? Well, one I can think of just offhand is The Fog of War. Right? Because A Fog of War does the same sort of thing. It tries to tell a particular story kind of at odds with what is historically correct. Now, Capturing the Freedmans, though, goes even further because it becomes even more difficult and elusive to tell the truth. Because although the film is constructed and the story's already done, because this had happened in the 1980s, it was one of these strange sort of quirks where there was an awful lot of sort of raw material, raw footage that was there for Jarecki to work with in constructing the story. So the film does try to pose the question, what is the truth? And the truth in this particular case is an especially difficult one. But the filmmaker does try to use this home movie footage, to construct a narrative around which we are going to sort of weigh the evidence, right, quote unquote, and become the jury that is going to decide the guilt or innocence of the major characters. So what argument is Jarecki making about the Friedmans? Well, it turns out that Jarecki is, and this is a kind of an interesting story, as much about the film as its reception. What happened with Capturing the Freedmans was when it was shown at Sundance the year prior, the film was structured so that depending on your own sort of gut instincts, your biases or prejudices or whatever, whether or not you're aware of them, that was often the way in which you would decide the guilt or innocence of the principal parties in the film. And Jarecki looked at the sort of the scorecards because focus groups are important. And it looked like it was literally down the middle, 50-50, right? Some thought they were guilty, others thought they were innocent. So Jarecki's kind of made that the marketing trick, right? The marketing angle that he would present the film under. And whenever he was interviewed about it, he purposely did not come down on one side or the other. He basically wanted the filmmakers the audience, right? The viewer to decide for themselves if the Friedmans were guilty as charged or they were innocent. So is he suggesting that Albert and Jesse are innocent? He is kind of moving in that direction, but he tries to sit on the fence almost to a fault, because I will get into some detail after that as to where Well, to what degree Jarecki tried to be too objective, all right, by purposely removing material and leaving things out so that so that the viewer would not be able to come down on one side or the other and have to figure it out for themselves. Now, was the family delusional? Were these things actually occurring? And the family just simply was unwilling to face it. So we are kind of watching through the home movies, and of course the home movies juxtaposed with interviews in the present day. We're basically watching a family unravel right in front of us, and it's difficult, right? It's very difficult because in the same way that Titicut Follies last week, the issue of privacy, right? The issue of sort of prying into another person's personal affairs. Literally, this is what this film is about in the worst way possible. So is he suggesting that the family is delusional? Yes, he is. Are they trying to hide something? We don't know. Have they tried to sort of psychoanalyze themselves into a position where they're going to condone their behavior? We don't know. But when you're watching it, think of these things. And then whatever the decision that you make, guilt or innocence, just kind of tally up in your own mind, the perspective you took, guilty or innocent, how you came to that decision. Because the film is really essentially asking us to be the jury in this story. Now, one of the things that the film does, what Jarecki is able to do, he's able to show us that there are some serious issues with using certain techniques by the police or by psychologists that render problematic the evidence that could then be collected to be presented in court. And one of them is the problem with the use of hypnosis, that you can suggest things to people, and the end result is, well, you give them kind of a trigger word, we'll say, although a trigger word typically is associated with something else. Let's say a certain word around which other ideas will sort of rotate around. And the end result is suddenly the person starts to remember things as if it was related to this word that's just been sort of given to them to consider, rather than just presenting the evidence as is. What the problem is with hypnosis is you are unconsciously guiding the person to think a certain way. Now, there's interviews with the victims, and we obviously don't see these people, but they present information that is pretty damning, and then other times not so clear. It's very, very elusive. And I will read some documentation here, both today and Wednesday, just to kind of show you how difficult it is for us to decide conclusively, one way or the other, if Mr. Friedman and his son are in fact guilty. So is Arnold Friedman actually guilty of the crimes that he's been charged with? Now, there's also the issue of how do you interrogate a child? I mean, there are times when ideas that are presented to a child, they don't understand. They can't comprehend what it is that you're asking them to consider and to admit, experiencing, for example. So all of the issues that we see being played out in this film have thankfully been since addressed in the courts and in the psychiatric field to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. So if the film serves a purpose, it is a kind of cautionary tale. It is telling us that there are inherent dangers with using hypnosis, inherent dangers in interviewing children, the way that you would interview an adult, the plea bargaining. I'll do this if I'm allowed to do that. I mean, spoiler alert, but Arnold Friedman appears to plead guilty to the charge of pedophilia and child molestation in order to prevent his own son from going to prison. So by pleading guilty, he's trying to save his son's life, or at least his son's future in prison. Now, was that a plea bargain that was realistic and based on truth, or was it simply an incredible sacrifice that Arnold Friedman does on behalf of his son to keep him out of jail? So these kinds of things really sort of become very, very important. So we see a variety of different people, deteriorate and fall apart. Watch for David. Arnold's family background is really bizarre. As a child, he lived in basically what sounds like a one room, not even one bedroom, a one room apartment with his mother, who would regularly bring in, basically partners, sexual partners. And her own son, Arnold, right, as a young boy, is there witnessing it, or at least hearing it in the dark. And so we look at Arnold and we begin to think, okay, even if he's guilty, maybe extenuating circumstances, this kind of thing, maybe there's a reason for his behavior, and maybe we can go easy on him. So these are the kinds of things that we discover. And then we as a jury, right, the viewer/jury, need to make sense of all of this. There is, at one point, there's an admission by Arnold that he sexually assaulted his own brother, Howard. And so that Arnold was displaying homosexual tendencies at a very, very young age. But to tie homosexuality with abuse, that in itself is something that is very, very questionable. It just simply is not done these days. Those two things are utterly unique and separate. And yet in the film, Howard doesn't remember anything. So we don't know. Jesse's behavior outside the courtroom, partying it up and acting like everything's just fine. Very strange responses to what's going on. Arnold's letters to his lawyer. A lot of these things, when you look at them and you see the context in which they occur, they both cast doubt on guilt, but they also don't clarify his innocence either. It's very muddy, to say the least. So the film is riddled with these strange contradictions. The video diaries, and these were never meant to be shown in public. These video diaries document in a very real way, in a very visceral kind of way, just how that family is literally falling apart. And Mrs. Friedman in particular, pay attention to her, because it's basically a bunch of boys, talking to each other, and she, as time goes on, feels more and more alienated from this group, especially with what they've been charged with, which is sexual abuse of children. It sounds like the father and the son were participating in it, and Mrs. Friedman is obviously shocked by these allegations and just is trying to make sense of it. So this is what I mean, where we're prying into the private affairs of these individuals, and these films were made, these home movies were made, but for who? Because the video diaries are just that. They should be private, documents that only David should be privy to. But here we are watching it as a substantial part of the film. Now, the other thing, too, that I want you to consider is the fear and hysteria in the community, both in Great Neck, but also in America at the time. In the 1980s, there was an absolute abhorrent fascination with sexual crimes. And I'd like you to watch it's about 10 minutes long, 10, 12 minutes. It's kind of a background to this story and many others. The McMaster public school, sort of public school, a daycare, was basically the same. It was the same sort of thing. There was this absolute hysteria around sexual abuse, and yet everybody thought it was happening. The media jumped all over it, and they're guilty as charged, and these people were basically dragged through the mud. Their lives were ruined, and yet ultimately no conclusive evidence was ever found. And of course, which only led to the kind of idiocy with QAnon, screaming, the baby-eating satanic Democrats, blah blah blah. That it's fed and fueled from the same hysteria that we will see in that short documentary about what the 1980s were like in terms of these particular kinds of crimes. So it's not saying much with the abilities of individuals to simply wait for the evidence to come in. Really, that's kind of really what we should be doing. But the film itself, right, is constructed like a kind of court case. We'd like to present the evidence here, and we as a viewer are going to decide, whether the Arnold Friedman and his son are guilty or not. And so that really kind of puts a heavy onus on us as just the viewer, because now we're having to make very conscious decisions based on what we see. There's one short scene in the film where we hear in the voiceover, police officers saying, well, we showed up, we did an investigation, and there were magazines laying all over the place, and the shots in the film, which is the evidence, the actual photographic evidence of the of not the attack on the house, but the fact that they searched the house. They were taking pictures, and yet there isn't a stack of magazines anywhere. So the film visually undercuts what is being said in the soundtrack. And of course, Jarecki is very good at putting into our heads the possibility of reasonable doubt. There is the chance, right, that they could be innocent, and it is the result of hysteria, because it definitely was there. Please do have a look at this film, the NBC film on, the history of this kind of hysteria, which is 40 years ago, but we still see it sort of pop up every time we hear that this kind of a crime has been committed. It's like the worst of the worst, and people have great difficulty in trying to wait for the evidence to come in. People will be judge, jury, and executioner as soon as they hear a person's name is associated with a crime. Oh, it's got to be him. The same thing happens in this film. The film sort of thinks about the possibility that perhaps they've been railroaded, perhaps they've been set up, perhaps that the evidence was very selectively manipulated, because we know the interviews were for sure. So, Capturing the Freedmans has this rare power to provoke viewers into thinking, arguing, and ultimately addressing their own prejudices about pornography, pedophilia, homosexuality. Difficult subjects if you don't have direct experience to consider, and of course the associations with them, because each one of those topics are in and of themselves sort of distinct. There is probably more use of pornography than ever before. Homosexuality is no longer looked at as some sort of deviant behavior. It is more and more accepted in society, but pedophilia, no, it isn't. So to use that as a glue between all these three different topics makes it a very loaded and difficult issue to kind of consider objectively and rationally. And that's exactly what the film does. So, questions for you to think about when you're watching the film. The home movies, not meant for us to be watched. Certainly we, the viewer of the film, they were made by David for David to watch. And regardless, they're there, right? They're there to sort of inform and create a background and to kind of create a jigsaw puzzle in which hopefully all the pieces fit together. But ask yourself how the home movies change the way that we see that we watch the film and experience the film, experience the veracity of it, right? Its truthfulness. Now, one thing that is interesting is Arnold at this point has now committed suicide in jail before Jarecki started to work on the film. But his presence as a father, as a sacrificial lamb, or as a guilty party, it's up to you, is very much present in the film. His absence is very much present in the film. The fact that he's no longer there. Arnold's actions and his words and his behavior, his decisions to plead guilty, very much inform what is happening in the film. So although he's not there, not interviewed, his presence is very much seen and understood and felt. Seth refused an interview, but he's still present. So there are people in the film that we don't speak to or we don't hear from, but are still in the mix, right? They're still in the film because Seth was a family member. So we have to ask ourselves, in the middle of all of this, and I could not imagine how much it would turn your world upside down to be charged with something like this, let alone convicted. Do we have the right to watch this kind of film where this family is literally unraveling, right? It's falling apart. It's having to deal with these criminal charges. It would destroy literally any family. I don't think there would be a family that would survive this very well. And outwardly, they may seem like they're together, but behind closed doors, which is essentially what the film is doing, it's throwing open those doors and saying, here's what was really going on as this court case was developing. So that part is not after the fact. This is in the moment. So having footage shot in the moment, not knowing what's going to happen, really that's people at the most vulnerable, right? So the film plays with that, and to say the least, it has very many voyeuristic qualities to it, especially given the subject matter. But the home movies increase that voyeurism. You hear one line, if you're not me, you shouldn't be watching this. That's one of the warnings from Arnold to whoever may be watching this video. So there is this kind of, privacy and sort of, this should be something separate. That you shouldn't be watching this, but here we are. That's exactly what we're doing. We're watching this. So Jarecki's position as a filmmaker in relation to the content and the material, he does try to remain objective and impartial. But what happens is it allows him to kind of escape responsibility because of how difficult the material is. It is complex. If what Arnold said, regarding his childhood is true, then clearly that may help us to understand why he behaved the way that he did. And so you can ask yourself, in trying to unravel and fit this very complex narrative into a kind of straightforward, almost 2-hour long film about these events, and of course following the events, because remember, this has occurred already. The home footage is now sort of sewing this whole thing together in real time, but we have interviews with people after the fact. So they have time to reflect and think back on what's going on. So you can ask yourself, was Jarecki maybe too objective, right? He was perhaps too easy on his subjects. So we've talked about various kinds of filmmaking, right? The modes of documentary, expository, or the voice of, let's say something else. The voice, right? Not necessarily voice of God, but the voiceover is at the service of telling the truth and organizing the material. And the images work to substantiate what is being heard. Ask yourself, is that what's going on here? Because there's certainly many examples where what's being said is being contradicted by what we're seeing. So think of that. Think of, is it an expository film? It does have certain qualities of it. We have experts, whether they're psychologists or involved with the law, that give us some kind of background as to what's going on. And so it does help. But what we're seeing as they're speaking, does that undercut or does it support what they're saying? Because if it supports, that's that expository form. If it doesn't and it contradicts it, then it's more self-reflective, right? It is very much aware that it is virtually impossible to capture the truth of something which has occurred in the past. And the only thing that we have that would be considered more truthful are these home movies that were really not meant for anyone to see. So kind of a strange situation. So it does have some poetic moments. I have a short clip, which is the intro, the first 5 minutes of Blue Velvet. And while I was watching Capturing the Freedmans, it kind of made me think of David Lynch's film, Blue Velvet, which came out it's 1986, 87. I looked at the thing for a little bit, but it came out in the mid-80s. Now, this film came out in 2003, but I wonder if Jarecki had seen Blue Velvet, and very, very briefly, the opening is this sort of idyllic world. Everything seems to be almost too perfect, and within the first few minutes, we start seeing things kind of go off the rails very quickly in a very strange and bizarre kind of way. If you've never watched Blue Velvet, I highly recommend it. It's one of David Lynch's better films, and very rich with ideas and possibilities. But just watch the first 5 minutes, the opening 5 minutes, because it sets a tone that is very similar to Capturing the Freedmans, which is the sort of under the facade or behind the facade of this sort of otherwise wonderful community. And we see shots of, people out playing golf and shopping, and, we've got garden sprinklers and all the pretty stuff, all the nice stuff that makes, the suburbs what they are. And under this is this ugly truth, right? This ugly truth about the sordid behavior of people. That's a kind of David Lynch moment that I haven't read Jarecki stating explicitly that that's what I model it on, but that's what I see. So after you watch the film, because there is no other to watch, please do watch that NBC documentary on the hysteria over the charges of sexual abuse back in the 80s, because this is the context in which this story is occurring. So you could see how quickly people flew off the handle completely and reason and rationality was gone. But also have a look at the intro to Blue Velvet in the tone of the film, the tone of the Friedman's film. Look at the two of them and see, the same kind of thing is going on. There's a certain tone or kind of viewpoint that's being established in both those films. This idea of a rosy, pretty surface hiding something ugly underneath. So that's kind of what I want you to think about. All right, so just some information here. We're going to look at a bit more on Monday. So it's a 2003 HBO documentary produced and directed by Andrew Jarecki, and it focuses on the 1980s investigation of Arnold and Jesse Friedman for child molestation. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary in the same year, and some of Friedman's alleged victims and family members actually wrote to the awards committee protesting the nomination. Now, their identities were protected, so we don't know who they were, but we know that they contacted them and said, wait a minute, this is like sordid. Do you realize what the content of this film is? So Jarecki initially was making the short film Just a Clown, which he completed, and I mentioned to you it was actually about David Friedman. And during his research, Jarecki learned that David Friedman's brother Jesse and his father Arnold had pleaded guilty to child sex abuse, and more so, and I'm not quite sure what Mr. Jarecki was expecting to find, but he found out that the family had an archive of home movies. So I wonder what his motivation was. Like maybe we could find that the literal smoking gun. But anyway, that was what intrigued him in the story. So Jarecki interviewed some of the children involved and ended up making a film focusing on the Friedmans. Now the question becomes, is this a true story? Real charges were brought against real people in a real community, but it's also a documentary loaded with all kinds of fictional elements, because really at the end, we don't know if people are telling the truth, right? We don't. Are they saying things to advance their agenda? Oh, I'm a poor victim, and I do not in any way wish to condone, victimhood, but people are presenting themselves as victims, whether they're being charged or whether they were the actual victims in the crime. So it does have these fictional moments where what's being said cannot be corroborated in any significant way with proof. And this is kind of what makes the film so slippery, so elusive. The Nassau County DA office, they blasted the same film as misleading, accused the filmmakers of interfering with the probe that they were responsible for reopening to see what had actually happened. And it raised further questions about the guilt of a father and son convicted of child molestation, being criticized by 6 of the former victims, who said the film omitted or distorted important information about their case. So even those individuals who were interviewed said that no, the information was not the way in which we presented it. So the synopsis is the following, like the background and what occurs in the film is the following. So it is an investigation into Arnold Friedman and his life following 1987, when the U.S. Post Office intercepts a kiddie porn magazine coming from the Netherlands. So they search his Great Neck home and they find a collection of child pornography. Now, we never see what they collect. We see magazine covers. They're kind of distorted, so it's hard to see. But there's no clear evidence that these are the magazines they found. These are magazines that are of the same kind, but are these actual police photographs? Because watch when the police officer says, we raided the place, we searched it, and we find magazines laying all over the place, and yet there's nothing in the photographs. There's literally nothing. So we begin to suspect. So After learning that the Friedmans taught children computer classes from their home, local police began to suspect him of abusing his students. The Friedmans were allowed to stay at home in order to prepare for court. And that's when we start seeing the use of home movies to kind of document what's going on with Arnold Friedman and his son Jesse awaiting trial. So the home movie footage is not after the fact. It's during and, well, it's before and during all of these events. So the videos were not made for publishing in mind. It's just simply a way of recording the events that were happening to these people. And they are quite difficult at times because we see family dinners, conversations, and of course arguments. Elaine, Arnold's wife, really is not sure. Like, just imagine being married to someone charged with these crimes that are, at the very least, difficult to process. And you think, my partner is guilty of this? You begin to doubt everything. You begin to doubt everything you know to be true. So she's not sure of her husband's guilt and advised him to confess in order to protect their son. Now, immediately after, they were divorced, as you can imagine. So we don't know, again, did Arnold Friedman confess to a crime that he actually committed, or did he follow his wife's advice and plead guilty to protect his son? We know he pled guilty, but what was the motivation? What was the intentionality? So, Arnold Friedman, the father, pleads guilty to multiple charges of sodomy and sexual abuse, and according to the family, he confessed in the hopes that his son would be spared prison time. That we do know. Now, again, the motivation is, here's the evidence, but what was the intent, right? What was the motivating factor behind it? Jess Friedman later confessed as well, but later claimed he did so in order to avoid being sent to prison for life. He said that his own father had molested him. Jesse's lawyer, Peter Pinero, that we see, he visited Arnold in federal prison in Wisconsin. And there, Arnold admits to molesting 2 boys, but not 2 that were in the computer class. So we don't know. Did he or did he not? He's also quoted as claiming that when he was 13, he sexually abused his younger brother, Howard, who was 8 at the time. And Howard, we see interviewed in the film, saying he doesn't recall this. He does not recall this event. Now, people can mentally block a difficult trauma, and Howard may have successfully managed to do that. Or Howard is lying and it did occur. Or Arnold is lying and it didn't occur, and he's making up a story. Who knows? But we have this evidence presented to us, and we're the ones who have to make sense of it. So, Jess Friedman then said his father told him and his brother that he had sexually abused Howard. So they seem to corroborate it, but the very person, the victim, says, "No, I don't remember that." Now, Arnold Friedman did die by suicide in prison in 1995. He left a $250,000 life insurance for his son Jesse, so that he would be able, once he got out of prison, to maybe get his life together. And Jess Friedman, he was in prison and then eventually released from New York's Clinton Correctional Facility in 2001. And he served 13 years for his sentence. And he's right now currently running an online book-selling business. So the film did receive some good reviews, 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, an average of 8.46 out of 10. The website's sort of the consensus from critics, quote, "a haunting depiction of a disintegrating family and a powerful argument on the elusiveness of truth." Okay, sure. Elvis Mitchell of the New York Times said Mr. Jarecki so recognizes the archetypal figures in the Friedman home that he knows that to push things any further through heavy-handed assessment would be redundant. So he praised Jarecki for operating under the premise that first impressions can't be trusted, and the truth rests with each person telling their own story. So I won't say any more. We'll meet again on Wednesday and talk about it a little bit more and get a few more specific examples out of the film. But I do want to talk at that point on Wednesday about some of the some of the footage, some of the content that was not in the film, in order for Jarecki to capitalize on this kind of elusiveness of truth. So he could have very easily come down on one side or the other because there was evidence, but he chose to withhold it in order to create a document that would cast real doubt on the truth claims being made in this film. Now, was it for cinematic purposes? Or was it simply for entertainment? Or was it a very clear strategy by Jarecki to make a film that is as troubling as Capturing the Freedmans? So have a look at it, either before or after. You can take a look at the other clips, but there is no other film. There is a viewing quiz, though, that will start tomorrow. It's Sunday afternoon, about 20 to 2. There's a viewing quiz that opens tomorrow morning and runs for the full week. So do watch the film and then complete the quiz on Capturing the Freedmans. That's what the quiz is for or about. So there's no secondary film other than the first 5 minutes of Blue Velvet. And think of that opening when you watch Capturing the Freedmans, because the same kind of tone is going on, the same sort of like this idyllic suburban life and this kind of awful ugliness underneath that it hides. So that's kind of the reason why I want you to watch it. And also the NBC showed a short documentary on the mass hysteria of sexual crimes in the 1980s. That is the background that informs this film. So have a look at the film, and we will see each other on Wednesday. Take care. Have a good weekend.